Hello and welcome to Water Stories, the podcast. I'm Eve Barro, and this podcast is a production of BioBAT Art Space. As we embark on each episode, we invite you to immerse yourself in exciting discussions that illuminate the vitality of water, echoing the themes explored by the artists featured in our Brooklyn exhibition on show until June 2025. Enjoy! Today we are speaking with Clare Brant, who is a professor of 18th century literature and culture at King's College London. She's currently conducting research on the topic of underwater lives and the relations between literature and science in marine and environmental contexts. In fact, her upcoming book, Underwater Lives, Humans, Species, Oceans, brings literary, historical, and aesthetic thinking to the oceans seen through human eyes. Clare, it's such a pleasure to have you join us today to tell us a bit more about your work. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Eve. It's an absolute pleasure to join you.
So the intersection between literary, historical, and aesthetic perspectives on the ocean in combination with your background in 18th century literature is such a unique and fascinating space to be in. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about your journey and what sparked your interest in exploring aquatic life in that way.
Yeah, sure. It is an odd twist in a way. I'm a professor of 18th century literature and culture, and I got interested in life writing. Life writing was a way to bring biography and autobiography into literary criticism, and then it expanded so that now it addresses an enormous number of forms, including digital. So very broad and a neat way to join up disciplines that are otherwise too separated, I think. In some ways, it was quite a natural transition for me through forms of first-person non-fiction. I worked a lot on letters, but I've always loved the sea. And I grew up all over the world, often in places where there wasn't any television. So the sea entertained us instead. And I was happy as a clam, just swimming and snorkeling and watching fish. And as an adult, as one does, I had a few occasions of complete wipeout, and in one of them I learnt to dive, and I started to learn a little bit of what I was looking at. I did some courses and learnt some marine biology, and then somebody gave me a book which was Philip Diolet's The Undersea Adventure, and I was absolutely smitten because it combined poetry, philosophy, marine biology in ways that lit a spark, I guess. And then I read other underwater books. And it turned out there were a great many. And I thought, there isn't any book about this literature. And I think there should be. So that's what I'm trying to write.
That's so interesting how it's a combination between maybe your personal life and your personal interest and fascination for the ocean with your maybe more academic interest, and then also the books you've read. I think you just mentioned, was it The Undersea Adventure, which was your first experience of maybe something that was so interdisciplinary in terms of our relationship with the sea. So I'm curious to hear more about this, what this interdisciplinary perspective has to bring to this understanding we have of the sea, rather than maybe looking at the sea from one single perspective or field.
I think, in some ways, there's a continuity in that really I'm a historian of ideas. So having written about 18th century letters, I wrote about 18th century balloons as an object around which there are a great many ideas, cultural, literary, artistic, aspirational, futurist, all kinds of things. So in a way, the underwater book is a natural progression from that. How do people write about their experiences underwater? It's a little complicated because there is a history to it, and I try to make that clear. So what was written in the 1950s has a rather different framework from what was written, say, in the 1990s. But I think despite literary history applying, there are also modulations of ideas of wonder, practices of care, also, sadly, practices of non-care. And of course, now we have a climate crisis, which is changing a great many things, and particularly around writing about coral. So although it is interdisciplinary, in a sense, we come back to the figure of the diver who could be a scientist, could be somebody on holiday, could be a professor of literature. We all have this opportunity to go underwater and see it for ourselves and respond to it, really, in ways that are fascinatingly various, I think.
You mentioned that you are interested in the history of ideas, which is such an interesting concept, and like this idea of continuity and maybe following concepts such as wonder, practice of care and non-care through time. And I think you also mentioned corals. I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about maybe how one of these ideas, either wonder or practice of care or non-care, has evolved through times, because you mentioned maybe we would write about certain things in different ways according to the time we're in. So is there one of these topics that you've been able to follow through time?
Yes, I think they wonder particularly. Natasha Abramowski has written a lovely book about underwater writings as an aesthetic of wonder, but she stops in 1945, I think. And she said to me that's because she thinks it doesn't go on after. I beg to differ. I think people do still feel tremendous wonder when they enter this extraordinary world full of so much colour, vivacity, life, strangeness, even in the context of coral collapse and the transformation of beautiful, thriving, healthy reefs into mounds of slime, really, in some cases. People's grief is written against a sense of loss of wonder. So yes, it does depend a little bit where you dive, perhaps how much you've been diving. So an older generation of scientists, divers who work on coral, have been particularly smitten by grief at reef decline because they saw reefs in their pristine state. So what they call shifting baseline syndrome, as it were, if you didn't see it when it was Eden, it looks right, maybe. But if you did know it as Eden, then you see what's got lost as well. So people's ages can make a difference, and where they're diving and what historical moment they're in.
That's so interesting that you mentioned also maybe the place of aesthetics, or how people's individual perception of what they see in the sea might it be like, because there's so many colors or so many things happening and like their own perspective on it, how it affects maybe the continuity of their experience or like wonder of the sea. So I'm really curious about the place of aesthetics and our sort of sensory perception of the sea in how we relate to it.
Aesthetics is quite a hot category at the moment. Killian Quigley has been writing about this, and Margaret Cohen also have done a very nice book about the aesthetics of undersea. And Killian Quigley especially says aesthetics are intrinsic because the minute that you want to talk about it or write about it, you're using language. And so your choice of language has aesthetic import in it. And therefore, we are essentially always reading the oceans. So paying attention to how we do that and how we describe it, it's not some fancy add-on, it's absolutely core.
So is that where your interest in life writing and first-person nonfiction comes from, having maybe studying more specifically the place of the person who is writing about like how they perceive the sea? Is that where it's coming from?
Yes, there's certainly tremendous biographical potential in underwater life writing. It turns out that not only did Jacques-Yves Cousteau write an enormous amount himself, and some of it with other people, including Philippe Dielet, but all his circle wrote books as well. So everybody kind of wanted to say this was what it was like for me. And you can explain some of the frameworks as biographically specific. Also, I think it makes a difference what ocean you're diving in. We pay a lot of attention to coral, but there are other kinds of writing, other oceans as well.
And I think you mentioned just before the importance of maybe situatedness, or the sense of place of where you are, because maybe, and let me know if I'm wrong, but maybe we tend to speak of the ocean or the sea as if it's this one gigantic water body that's just completely uniform, which is not the case. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
There has been some interest recently in thinking about world ocean. Steve Mentz has been writing about this, that partly because of globalization, we connect spaces perhaps more easily. And the historian Helen Rodbudowski has also written brilliantly about history underwater. So how in the mid-20th century, it was a frontier-like space. But it seemed to me to be quite an American conception, or rather, it made me feel quite European with a rather different history. So, for example, one of the things that Cousteau and his friends took up was underwater archaeology, which scuba let them do in pioneering ways. They were diving in the Mediterranean, which was full of Roman and Greek wrecks, and they were really engaged with the Mediterranean Sea as something that was foundational to how Europe saw itself. So the frontier relevant to them isn't space, though Cousteau is often associated with that. I think instead the frontier is time. They wanted to make underwater join up with European history. So that's an example of the kind of time, space, geographical, historical thinking.
That's so interesting. I never thought about, how we can maybe see through time through the sea. That's really fascinating. And you mentioned, yes, underwater archaeology and maybe the technological means or the tools that would make this possible. So I'm also curious about, yes, maybe how technology and the tools that allow us to maybe dive in different ways or to observe the sea in different ways or to relate to it in different ways, how this impacts how we relate to the sea itself.
Technology is really important. I have a chapter on the deep ocean, which was first perhaps written about from experience by William Beebe, who went down in a bathyscaphe off Bermuda in the 1930s. And now, of course, it's much safer to use ROVs, remote operated vehicles, rather than have people go down. So people watch on monitors from above. But for those people who have been down, they have an extraordinary experience of entering primordial time. Weird things happen physiologically too. James Hamilton Patterson says he was able to remember things that he'd completely forgotten since childhood. It was like his memory was being de-encrusted. And in this often featureless world of the deep ocean, although now we know it has much more life than we thought it did, people kind of feel they're going back to the beginning of creation. So it's an astonishing kind of encounter with something you simply can't have on land in the same way.
I'm wondering, from your personal experience, did it ever happen to you that you went somewhere and the experience of the sea through your body really mattered and you really paid attention to that?
Oh, yes, often, particularly in current, it can be so fierce. I once sat out most of a dive behind some rocks because it was like being in a howling gale. You really couldn't kind of move through it. And as it happened, there was a turtle also kind of sheltering behind the rock. And the turtle and I were kind of slightly tumbly in this equivalent of a high wind. So I was very conscious then of bodies and how little and hopeless we are, really.
And that's amazing that through maybe this event, you sort of formed this connection with this other individual that was just there and maybe living the same thing as you. Do you think that paying more attention to the oceans also means paying more attention to the other organisms that are there? And maybe, like, is there a form of empathy, or do you form bonds with these other species and individuals that you come across?
Yes, hugely. A large chunk of my book is about the species bonds that people form. People particularly fall in love with turtles. There's a growing amount of octopus literature where people are really fascinated by the kind of difference and wanting to connect through touch and the sense of the haptic, a kind of awareness of the sense of touch, which is a bit different underwater. So Craig Foster, who made the film My Octopus Teacher, and has also co-authored a book called Underwater Wild. In that book, he and Ross Freilich, his co-author, are really passionate about touch as a way of connecting. And normally underwater, the rule is sort of look, don't touch. But Foster and Freilich say that they had creatures who would approach them and come and sit in their hands. So they felt this tremendous transfiguring connectivity with them and intimacy and exchange, actually.
Now I'm really curious about this octopus literature that you mentioned. Can you tell us more about this?
Well, Cy Montgomery's book, The Soul of an Octopus, which covers her relationships with a series of octopus, is in the New England Aquarium in Boston. There's a sort of paradox that octopuses are super intelligent, but they don't live very long, sadly. And also for female octopuses, once they lay their eggs, they're kind of doomed to die because then they go into decline. They spend a long maternal period wafting water over the eggs to keep them oxygenated. So it's this sort of awful thing that you know the octopus is going to die. And a correlation really of motherhood and mortality, which is not like anything else, certainly in our lives or any other creature's lives. So octopuses have been really intriguing people because they have complex senses, which are touch-based. Cy Montgomery says it looks like every tentacle has like a different character. It does slightly different things. So we can be left-handed, right-handed, but an octopus can be kind of eight-handed. So it really stretches people's sense of consciousness, actually. And yes, various other people have written about that.
Do you think forming bonds with these other species that have different senses and maybe different life cycles than our own, could it be also an opportunity to reflect back on also how we live and our relationship with each others and how we approach even our own consciousness?
Mm. Absolutely. I mean, there's a book out about animals dreaming and whether or not they have an unconscious, or whether there's some other arrangement, as it were. Almost everybody who writes about a particular species says, you can't think about your species without thinking about humans, because humans have such impact on the conditions in which other species live. And on the whole, it comes out as a kind of mixed story, that humans are capable of very touching and devoted and passionate practices of care, but there has been no too well, sadly, capable of violence, greed, destruction, thoughtlessness, damage. And these days, there's perhaps a different argument also, which is that people are looking at the oceans in terms of carbon capture. So, for instance, there was a siphonophore, a colonial animal who can stretch over tremendous distances, and one was found in the Ningaloo Canyons in 2020, which was described as the longest ever creature. It was 46 meters long. That's almost twice as long as a female blue whale, females being bigger than the males. And it turned out that siphonophores had some champions because it was thought that they can assist in carbon capture. So we also see this discourse of the oceans as something that humans manage. And maybe that's necessary in the Anthropocene because we've made such a mess of it that managing is a way of saying we need to unmake some of that mess. But it's also slightly disturbing in that some of the most top coral scientists in the world have recently published an article where they adopt the language of business to suggest that some coral reefs should be invested in for reparation. It will pay us to put this right, as it were. So I think that's a kind of worrying trend, although possibly good may come out of it. Let's hope so. Of course, in between wonder and management, perhaps, is the whole difficult business of fisheries, which have traditionally had management and indeed a great deal of mismanagement in the case of tuna particularly. So the kind of, there's a chunk of fish-focused underwater life writing, which laments the near extinction of fish species as food for us, and that's a kind of ongoing battle. I think also sometimes people think with global warming, that creatures can move deeper, and that so they'll find cooler water and it'll all be all right. But that's not really possible because most of all the niches lower down are occupied, and quite often the conditions for sustaining higher depth organisms just aren't there. So we're still stupidly thinking of oceans as somehow empty. There's lots of room in them, isn't there? No, there isn't. Things have found their places. And of course, this is going to be very difficult to resolve in relation to underwater mining for manganese and nickel and cobalt.
Where do you think this idea of oceans being empty comes from? Why do you think that's
Mm.
just something we believe?
I think it's got a long history. Again, Steve Mentz covers some of this. He's an early modern scholar. So the history of oceans was for a very long time essentially the surface of the oceans. And what was underneath was monsters and emptiness, paradoxically. So scuba particularly, not just scuba, but also 19th century helmet diving kind of started it. But scuba democratized it, I think, where people could go and see that actually that really wasn't the case. It was full of all kinds of life having its own lives.
You said a really interesting word. You said that the different technological tools, like I think helmet diving and scuba, democratized diving. Do you think it's important that more people can have their own experience of the sea to realize that, well, the ocean is not empty, there are things there and they are important, and create their own sort of relationship with the sea? Do you think that could be a way for people to feel more responsibility towards the ocean and the life within it?
Yes, I think particularly when scuba arrived, people were very hopeful that this would be for everyone. There is, in fact, a gender politics to it, which is a little dispiriting. It's been much harder for women to have the same visibility, authority, access, and so on. Jeremy Stafford Deitch, in a 1991 book on coral reefs, says something interesting. He says diving isn't just a seaside activity anymore, but it's an opportunity to gain a first-hand insight into the fact that what exists beneath the waves must continue to do so. I think that puts it rather beautifully. It is complicated though, because as a diver, if you want to go and see coral, chances are you get on an aeroplane. So you've got a big carbon footprint, and ecotourism has complexities in terms of, yes, it brings money to communities. Yes, it makes underwater life kind of valuable in financial and cultural terms, but that doesn't necessarily do the creatures themselves any good in the longer run.
We talked about technology and we mentioned aesthetics. Well, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about maybe the place of art within this, because as you really rightly mentioned, if we all decide to go diving, it might not actually do any good. So I'm wondering if there's a place for art to maybe represent and bring us closer to the ocean without us having to actually go in the ocean.
Absolutely. I think we live in a fantastic age for this, particularly with YouTube, Google Earth with its ocean view. They said that more people went virtual diving when they put that up than had ever gone diving ever before. On the other hand, some of the things on YouTube, you can get long 4-hour sequences of coral reef footage that are meant to kind of help you to sleep. So it's like we have some strange uses for this. But it does mean we can share artistic things like never before. So one piece perhaps I particularly recommend, I think dance is doing really interesting things with underwater to do with the fluidity of movements, and also in a way practices of care through positioning of body, explorations, kind of liquidity. And lots of this is being done by freedivers, particularly Julie Gauthier and her partner Guillaume Nery. They made a wonderful film called One Breath Around the World, in part of which Guillaume Nery hangs out with a pod of sleepy sperm whales. Absolutely beautiful. What a privilege to be able to see it, which you can on YouTube.
Which is amazing. And it goes back to how when people were able to go sort of deeper in the ocean, they experienced different bodily reactions, or they really experienced it through their bodies. So it's really interesting that you mentioned dance, because maybe when we watch dancers, that's exactly what happens. We imagine what it would be like to move like they do, and maybe the sort of a proxy experience of underwater movement and what it implies, which is really interesting. I'm also curious to go back to this question of accessibility. I think you mentioned how our access to the sea could also be linked to gender politics, and how maybe certain people don't have the same means to maybe observe or connect to the sea. And I'm sure it goes also beyond gender, depending on like what community you belong to. So I'm wondering if in your work and in the works that you studied through your work and in the writings that you've read, if you've seen some trends or bias in terms of who is writing about the sea and who has access to it, and if that has an impact on how they talk about it.
Yes, definitely. I think I'm very aware that much of the literature that I'm dealing with is Western, and there are indigenous alternatives. They tend not to be literary, so they're harder to recover. But there are ways of doing it. There's a lovely study of Polynesian fishing culture by an Australian anthropologist, which has really different kind of protocols for how you organize and describe and understand fish. So I'm very pleased to be able to find these things. And decolonizing science it's also a live topic in the naming of fish, which perhaps doesn't sound the most exciting topic, but in a way it is, because like aesthetics, it's a framework for describing life. And in the movement to decolonize science, people have noticed that there are an awful lot of fish names that are named after Western scientists and their colleagues, friends, partners, children, what have you. So the question of whether or not you should change some of those names, or whether you should certainly encourage different kinds of naming practices. There are some rather charming examples of democratic naming, where names go out to competition to the public, or school children are invited to think of a name for a newly discovered creature. So I think people are aware that it's been a very privileged world of having access, including through diving, which is not a cheap hobby on the whole. And so people are conscious of how might that be expanded.
That's really interesting because it also goes back to maybe these practices of care and how we reimagine how we can live together in this world, together, not only in our relationship with other species, but in our relationship with each other's and the room we live for each other and how we take care of each other. So that's really interesting that mentioning this practice of trying to decolonize science through maybe renaming or paying attention to different strategies to fishing or to relating to other species, which I'm sure even when you pay specific attention to a specific even species, I don't know, like turtles, or even if you look at coral, as we mentioned, place is very important, the place where they are, and also the community in which they are, and how these communities traditionally take care of this underwater life. So I'm wondering if you've also come across writings that incorporated these ideas of how communities relate to the ocean, rather than maybe someone that would individually go to the ocean and describe what they've seen.
Yes, particularly in the Pacific, I think, where actually there is a tradition of diving. You know, the indigenous diver is very good at going underwater, ostensibly for hunting purposes, but not just exploitative, let's say, but also kind of coexistence. But it is much harder, I think, to find those sources if they're not written in some way. Another world, I think, that is very important, where actually it is more recoverable. I've followed some fish stories, including salmon, who are rather a complicated world. There's Atlantic salmon, there's Pacific salmon. Idiots have bred Atlantic salmon in the Pacific and vice versa. So actually it's all muddled up typographically. But to the peoples of the Northwest Pacific, the salmon peoples, they have cultural traditions, some of which are written down, some of which are still lived, in which understanding salmon lives and models of subsistence coexistence have been very strong. So that's a rather nice way to recover some ways of thinking about it.
That's very interesting. And now I will have a new obsession, which will be fish stories. I'm going to look into this. That's amazing. So I think we're coming to the end of this interview, and I believe you brought a little something to read for us.
Yes, it's from my third collection of poems, which is called Accidentals in the Main, published by Shoestring Press. There is a pun on main as the old word for sea. And this is the poem that gave rise to the title. And it came about partly because I could never quite get a handle on the idea that a whole island of vegetation could come about from a bird dropping a seed or a coconut washing up. And it's because we have trouble grasping long scales, I think. Anyway, it's called Coconut and Crab. Once I came up from a dive and found I'd surfaced eye to eye with a small coconut, bobbing in leaf, cradling in its shoot a tiny, shiny crab. All hail, adventurer. Both crab and I were startled. It shot away to dark side of its moon. I tried to reassure it. Castaway navigator, I did not mean to interrupt your epic journey. We are such accidentals in the main, coconut conquistadors heading for fresh land.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for this really, really interesting conversations.
Thank you,
But
Eve. It's been an absolute pleasure. Your questions have been lovely.
thank you for listening to this episode. We hope you enjoyed it. You can find all of our other episodes online on our platforms, as well as in our listening room in our exhibition space in Brooklyn, New York. Bye!